Japanese bunkers repelled assault, until Sherman Zippos sprayed 400-foot flames. September 15, 1944. A single Japanese pillbox on Peleliu stopped an entire Marine regiment dead in its tracks. 4 feet of reinforced concrete absorbed direct hits from 75 mm tank rounds, 14-inch naval shells, and demolition charges. 23 Japanese soldiers inside held their position for 8 hours while Marine casualties mounted. Engineers, artillery, and naval gunfire had all failed. The bunker would not break. Then a new weapon rolled forward, a Sherman tank with a modified turret and 290 gallons of thickened napalm. What happened next changed Pacific Island warfare forever and revealed the terrible truth about what happens when engineering meets overwhelming industrial power. The M4A3R3 Zippo flamethrower tank didn't just defeat Japanese fortifications, it made them irrelevant. While Japanese engineers spent months pouring concrete thick enough to survive battleship shells, American engineers developed a weapon that didn't need to penetrate at all. It simply burned everything inside until nothing lived. In this documentary, we reveal the shocking story of how flame warfare broke Japan's fortress strategy and the devastating human cost on both sides. What you'll discover: the engineering specifications of Japanese bunkers that survived naval bombardment, how concrete fortifications with 6-foot-thick roofs were designed and constructed, the technical details of Sherman flamethrower tanks and napalm composition, why conventional weapons failed against Japanese defensive positions, the tactics that made flame tanks the most feared weapon in the Pacific, casualty statistics showing 30% death rates among flamethrower crews, Japanese soldier testimony about the psychological terror of flame attacks, how Peleliu's lessons influenced Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the atomic bomb decision, the moral questions that haunted veterans for decades after the war, why this single weapon changed American strategy for the rest of the Pacific campaign. This isn't just about military technology, it's about the moment when fortress engineering met industrial warfare, when concrete and steel proved no match for chemistry and flame, and when both sides learned the true cost of total war. From Peleliu's coral ridges to Iwo Jima's volcanic caves, witness how the flamethrower tank transformed Pacific warfare and why the lessons learned in these battles influenced decisions that ended World War II. Subscribe for meticulously researched World War II documentaries that reveal the human stories behind history's most pivotal moments. Tags: #Peleliu, #Pacific War, #WW2 History, #Sherman Tank, #Flamethrower Tank, #Marine Corps, #World War II, #Military History, #Japanese Bunkers, #Island Warfare, #WWII Documentary, #Pacific Theater No. 1944, #Sherman Zippo, #M4 Sherman, #Bunker Warfare, #Iwo Jima, #Okinawa, #USMC, #1st Marine Division, #Japanese Defense, #Fortifications, #War History, #Historical Documentary, #WWII Battles, #Pacific Campaign, #Combat Engineering, #Military Technology, #Napalm Warfare, #Tank Warfare, #WWII Tanks, Marine Infantry, #Island Hopping, #World War II, #Second World War, Imperial Japan, #US Marines, #Pacific Islands, #WWII Tactics, #Military Tactics, #History Channel, #War Documentary, #Real History, #Untold History, #Forgotten Battles, #Pacific Battles, #Marine Corps History, #WWII Weapons, #Combat History, #Historical Events, Educational Video, #HistoryLovers, #Military Education, #WWII Facts, #Tank History, #Armored Warfare, #Flame Weapons, #Siege Warfare, #Defensive Fortifications, #Concrete Bunkers, #Tunnel Warfare, #Close Quarters Combat, #History Documentary, #True History, #Historical Accuracy, #WWII Research, Military Strategy, Tactical History, Industrial Warfare, Total War, Warfare Evolution, Pacific War Stories, Veteran Stories, Combat Veterans, WWII Memoir, War Memoir, Battle of Peleliu, Yamurbergal Ridge, Coral Ridges, Island Fortress, Japanese Fortifications, American Firepower # Eugene Sledge # With the Old Breed # Marine Raiders # Amphibious Assault # Beach Landing # WWII Infantry # Infantry Tactics # Urban Warfare # Cave Warfare # Defense In Depth # Fortress Warfare # Military Engineering # WWII Engineering # Weapons of WWII. Retry. The crisis began on a sunny Tuesday morning that gave no indication of the chaos to come. Irene arrived at the division at her usual time, carrying her usual coffee from the usual cafe, expecting a usual day of signals analysis. Instead, she found the operations center in controlled pandemonium. The Eastern Territories, a region that had been experiencing low-level tensions for months, had erupted into open conflict overnight. A separatist militia group calling themselves the Crimson Front had seized control of several key positions, including a civilian detention facility in the town of Ravensworth. Intelligence suggested they were holding approximately 200 civilians, mostly families who'd been accused of collaborating with the government. Lieutenant Voss had been dispatched to Ravensworth 3 days earlier for what was supposed to be a routine liaison meeting with local authorities. He'd been in the town when the Crimson Front launched their operation, and now he was missing, presumably captured along with the civilian population. Irene pulled up every piece of intelligence related to Ravensworth, her hands moving across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. The situation was worse than the initial reports suggested. The Crimson Front wasn't just holding civilians as leverage, they were planning something far more sinister. She found it in an intercepted communication, encrypted but not well enough to resist her decryption protocols. The message was chilling in its bureaucratic precision: execute Phase 3 at sunrise, Day 4. No survivors. Ensure complete documentation for propaganda purposes. Phase 3. Day 4. That gave them less than 72 hours. Irene felt her chest tighten as she read the message again, hoping she'd misunderstood. But the language was unambiguous. The Crimson Front was planning to execute all 200 civilians, plus any captured military personnel, in 3 days. And they were going to film it. Irene immediately escalated the intelligence to Major Kellerman, her report marked with the highest priority classification. She expected immediate action, a rapid response team, emergency authorization for a rescue operation. Instead, she got a meeting scheduled for the following morning to discuss response options. "Major, we don't have time for meetings," Irene insisted, standing in Kellerman's office with her report still pulled up on her tablet. "They're planning to execute everyone in 3 days. We need to move now." Kellerman looked up from his desk, his expression showing the professional patience of someone dealing with a subordinate who didn't understand how things worked. "Hill, I understand your concern, but military operations aren't authorized based on a single intercepted message. We need to verify the intelligence, consult with command, coordinate with diplomatic channels." "The intelligence is verified," Irene said, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. "I've cross-referenced it with 3 other communication intercepts. The Crimson Front has been planning this for weeks. The timeline is absolute." "Your interpretation of the intelligence," Kellerman corrected. "And even if your analysis is correct, we have protocols for situations like this. We don't launch military operations based on the emotional reactions of junior analysts." The dismissal stung, but Irene pressed forward. "Sir, Lieutenant Voss is among the hostages. One of our own officers is going to be executed along with 200 civilians if we don't act." "Which is exactly why we need to be careful," Kellerman replied. "Rushing into a hostile situation could get Voss and those civilians killed faster. The diplomatic team is working on negotiations. That's our best option right now." Irene wanted to argue, wanted to pull up the additional intelligence she'd gathered showing that the Crimson Front had no intention of negotiating. But she could see in Kellerman's expression that further argument would be counterproductive. She was the emotional analyst, the one who couldn't maintain professional distance. Anything more she said would only reinforce that perception. She left Kellerman's office and returned to her terminal, but instead of resuming her regular duties, she began a different kind of analysis. If headquarters wasn't going to authorize a rescue operation in time, she needed to understand what an unauthorized operation would require. The Crimson Front had seized a converted factory complex on the outskirts of Ravensworth. Satellite imagery showed the facility was heavily guarded, with patrols following predictable patterns. The civilians were being held in the main building, while captured military personnel, including presumably Lieutenant Voss, were separated into a smaller administrative structure. Irene began mapping the facility's defenses, analyzing patrol schedules, identifying blind spots in the security coverage. She told herself she was just being thorough, that this intelligence might be useful for whatever response headquarters eventually authorized. But deep down, she knew she was planning something far more direct. Over the next 2 days, as headquarters continued their deliberations and diplomatic channels produced nothing but bureaucratic delays, Irene worked on 2 parallel tracks. Officially, she continued her assigned duties, monitoring communications and filing reports. Unofficially, she was becoming an expert on every aspect of the Ravensworth facility and the Crimson Front's operational procedures. She intercepted additional communications that confirmed her worst fears. The execution wasn't just planned, it was organized with meticulous detail. The Crimson Front intended to use the massacre as a propaganda tool, a demonstration of their power and willingness to follow through on threats. They'd even prepared the location within the facility where the executions would occur, a courtyard visible from multiple angles for optimal camera coverage. What haunted Irene most was a brief communication she'd intercepted from someone inside the facility, likely a civilian with access to a hidden phone. The message was fragmentary, cut off mid-sentence, but 3 words came through clearly: please. Children here. Children. The intelligence reports had mentioned families, but seeing it stated so plainly, so desperately, made it real in a way that statistics never could. Somewhere in that facility, children were waiting to die because the proper channels were moving too slowly. On the 3rd day, with less than 24 hours remaining before the planned massacre, Irene attended another briefing where headquarters discussed response options with the same maddening deliberateness they'd shown from the beginning. A rescue operation was being considered, but it would require days of planning and authorization. Diplomatic efforts were continuing, though the Crimson Front had refused all communication attempts. The consensus seemed to be that they were doing everything possible within appropriate protocols. Irene sat at the back of the briefing room and realized with absolute clarity that headquarters was going to let those people die. Not through malice or incompetence, but through the simple mechanics of bureaucracy moving too slowly to matter. That evening, she returned to her small apartment and made a decision that would either save 200 lives or end her career and possibly her life. She was going to Ravensworth. Not as part of an authorized mission, but alone, using the intelligence she'd gathered to infiltrate the facility and somehow prevent the massacre. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was insane. She was an intelligence analyst, not a field operative. She had no combat training beyond basic military requirements, no experience in hostile infiltration, no support network if things went wrong. The mission would almost certainly fail, and failure would mean not just her own death but potentially triggering the massacre she was trying to prevent. But the alternative was to sit in her comfortable office, monitoring communications while 200 people, including children, were systematically executed. And that was something Irene Hill, the too emotional analyst who cared too much, absolutely could not do. She spent the night preparing, gathering equipment she technically wasn't authorized to access, downloading every piece of intelligence related to Ravensworth onto an encrypted drive, and writing a letter to her sister explaining why she'd made this choice. The letter was probably unnecessary, she fully intended to succeed. But it felt important to articulate her reasoning, to leave a record that this wasn't recklessness or emotional instability but a calculated decision based on the fundamental belief that some things were worth any risk. At 0300 hours, with sunrise and the planned massacre less than 3 hours away, Irene Hill left her apartment and began the journey to Ravensworth. She had no authorization, no backup, and no certainty that anything she attempted would work. But she had detailed intelligence, absolute determination, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important missions are the ones nobody authorizes. As she drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward hostile territory, Irene thought about what Lieutenant Voss had told her, that caring about the people they were supposed to protect wasn't a weakness. She was about to prove him right, or die trying. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The drive to Ravensworth took 2 hours through roads that grew progressively more damaged and deserted as Irene approached the conflict zone. She'd requisitioned a civilian vehicle from the motor pool using forged authorization codes, another item on the growing list of regulations she was violating. The car was unmarked, deliberately ordinary, the kind of vehicle that might belong to anyone. As dawn began to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Irene parked 3 kilometers from the detention facility and continued on foot. She'd studied satellite imagery until she could navigate the terrain with her eyes closed, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The ground was uneven, scattered with debris from earlier skirmishes, and every shadow felt like it might hide a patrol. Her pack contained everything she'd managed to gather: bolt cutters for the perimeter fence, a compact communication jammer she'd borrowed from the technical equipment locker, emergency medical supplies, and a sidearm she barely knew how to use. It wasn't much for infiltrating a heavily guarded facility, but it was all she had. She intercepted additional communications that confirmed her worst fears. The execution wasn't just planned, it was organized with meticulous detail. The Crimson Front intended to use the massacre as a propaganda tool, a demonstration of their power and willingness to follow through on threats. They'd even prepared the location within the facility where the executions would occur, a courtyard visible from multiple angles for optimal camera coverage. What haunted Irene most was a brief communication she'd intercepted from someone inside the facility, likely a civilian with access to a hidden phone. The message was fragmentary, cut off mid-sentence, but 3 words came through clearly: please. Children here. Children. The intelligence reports had mentioned families, but seeing it stated so plainly, so desperately, made it real in a way that statistics never could. Somewhere in that facility, children were waiting to die because the proper channels were moving too slowly. On the 3rd day, with less than 24 hours remaining before the planned massacre, Irene attended another briefing where headquarters discussed response options with the same maddening deliberateness they'd shown from the beginning. A rescue operation was being considered, but it would require days of planning and authorization. Diplomatic efforts were continuing, though the Crimson Front had refused all communication attempts. The consensus seemed to be that they were doing everything possible within appropriate protocols. Irene sat at the back of the briefing room and realized with absolute clarity that headquarters was going to let those people die. Not through malice or incompetence, but through the simple mechanics of bureaucracy moving too slowly to matter. That evening, she returned to her small apartment and made a decision that would either save 200 lives or end her career and possibly her life. She was going to Ravensworth. Not as part of an authorized mission, but alone, using the intelligence she'd gathered to infiltrate the facility and somehow prevent the massacre. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was insane. She was an intelligence analyst, not a field operative. She had no combat training beyond basic military requirements, no experience in hostile infiltration, no support network if things went wrong. The mission would almost certainly fail, and failure would mean not just her own death but potentially triggering the massacre she was trying to prevent. But the alternative was to sit in her comfortable office, monitoring communications while 200 people, including children, were systematically executed. And that was something Irene Hill, the too emotional analyst who cared too much, absolutely could not do. She spent the night preparing, gathering equipment she technically wasn't authorized to access, downloading every piece of intelligence related to Ravensworth onto an encrypted drive, and writing a letter to her sister explaining why she'd made this choice. The letter was probably unnecessary, she fully intended to succeed. But it felt important to articulate her reasoning, to leave a record that this wasn't recklessness or emotional instability but a calculated decision based on the fundamental belief that some things were worth any risk. At 0300 hours, with sunrise and the planned massacre less than 3 hours away, Irene Hill left her apartment and began the journey to Ravensworth. She had no authorization, no backup, and no certainty that anything she attempted would work. But she had detailed intelligence, absolute determination, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important missions are the ones nobody authorizes. As she drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward hostile territory, Irene thought about what Lieutenant Voss had told her, that caring about the people they were supposed to protect wasn't a weakness. She was about to prove him right, or die trying. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The drive to Ravensworth took 2 hours through roads that grew progressively more damaged and deserted as Irene approached the conflict zone. She'd requisitioned a civilian vehicle from the motor pool using forged authorization codes, another item on the growing list of regulations she was violating. The car was unmarked, deliberately ordinary, the kind of vehicle that might belong to anyone. As dawn began to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Irene parked 3 kilometers from the detention facility and continued on foot. She'd studied satellite imagery until she could navigate the terrain with her eyes closed, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The ground was uneven, scattered with debris from earlier skirmishes, and every shadow felt like it might hide a patrol. Her pack contained everything she'd managed to gather: bolt cutters for the perimeter fence, a compact communication jammer she'd borrowed from the technical equipment locker, emergency medical supplies, and a sidearm she barely knew how to use. It wasn't much for infiltrating a heavily guarded facility, but it was all she had. She intercepted additional communications that confirmed her worst fears. The execution wasn't just planned, it was organized with meticulous detail. The Crimson Front intended to use the massacre as a propaganda tool, a demonstration of their power and willingness to follow through on threats. They'd even prepared the location within the facility where the executions would occur, a courtyard visible from multiple angles for optimal camera coverage. What haunted Irene most was a brief communication she'd intercepted from someone inside the facility, likely a civilian with access to a hidden phone. The message was fragmentary, cut off mid-sentence, but 3 words came through clearly: please. Children here. Children. The intelligence reports had mentioned families, but seeing it stated so plainly, so desperately, made it real in a way that statistics never could. Somewhere in that facility, children were waiting to die because the proper channels were moving too slowly. On the 3rd day, with less than 24 hours remaining before the planned massacre, Irene attended another briefing where headquarters discussed response options with the same maddening deliberateness they'd shown from the beginning. A rescue operation was being considered, but it would require days of planning and authorization. Diplomatic efforts were continuing, though the Crimson Front had refused all communication attempts. The consensus seemed to be that they were doing everything possible within appropriate protocols. Irene sat at the back of the briefing room and realized with absolute clarity that headquarters was going to let those people die. Not through malice or incompetence, but through the simple mechanics of bureaucracy moving too slowly to matter. That evening, she returned to her small apartment and made a decision that would either save 200 lives or end her career and possibly her life. She was going to Ravensworth. Not as part of an authorized mission, but alone, using the intelligence she'd gathered to infiltrate the facility and somehow prevent the massacre. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was insane. She was an intelligence analyst, not a field operative. She had no combat training beyond basic military requirements, no experience in hostile infiltration, no support network if things went wrong. The mission would almost certainly fail, and failure would mean not just her own death but potentially triggering the massacre she was trying to prevent. But the alternative was to sit in her comfortable office, monitoring communications while 200 people, including children, were systematically executed. And that was something Irene Hill, the too emotional analyst who cared too much, absolutely could not do. She spent the night preparing, gathering equipment she technically wasn't authorized to access, downloading every piece of intelligence related to Ravensworth onto an encrypted drive, and writing a letter to her sister explaining why she'd made this choice. The letter was probably unnecessary, she fully intended to succeed. but it felt important to articulate her reasoning, to leave a record that this wasn't recklessness or emotional instability but a calculated decision based on the fundamental belief that some things were worth any risk. At 0300 hours, with sunrise and the planned massacre less than 3 hours away, Irene Hill left her apartment and began the journey to Ravensworth. She had no authorization, no backup, and no certainty that anything she attempted would work. But she had detailed intelligence, absolute determination, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important missions are the ones nobody authorizes. As she drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward hostile territory, Irene thought about what Lieutenant Voss had told her, that caring about the people they were supposed to protect wasn't a weakness. She was about to prove him right, or die trying. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The drive to Ravensworth took 2 hours through roads that grew progressively more damaged and deserted as Irene approached the conflict zone. She'd requisitioned a civilian vehicle from the motor pool using forged authorization codes, another item on the growing list of regulations she was violating. The car was unmarked, deliberately ordinary, the kind of vehicle that might belong to anyone. As dawn began to paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Irene parked 3 kilometers from the detention facility and continued on foot. She'd studied satellite imagery until she could navigate the terrain with her eyes closed, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The ground was uneven, scattered with debris from earlier skirmishes, and every shadow felt like it might hide a patrol. Her pack contained everything she'd managed to gather: bolt cutters for the perimeter fence, a compact communication jammer she'd borrowed from the technical equipment locker, emergency medical supplies, and a sidearm she barely knew how to use. It wasn't much for infiltrating a heavily guarded facility, but it was all she had. Irene began working through the security system, her intelligence training allowing her to navigate the unfamiliar interface with desperate speed. The facility used electronic locks controlled from this central terminal. If she could override the system, release the locks on the civilian detention areas and the military holding cells simultaneously, she could turn this situation from a controlled execution into complete chaos. Her fingers found the master control panel. The interface was in the local dialect, but she'd studied enough intercepted documents to understand the basic commands. She began initiating lockdown overrides, systematically unlocking doors throughout the facility while simultaneously disabling the alarm systems that would alert guards to the security breach. "What are you doing?" The voice came from behind her, sharp with suspicion and anger. Irene spun to find a crimson front officer standing in the doorway, his hand moving toward the weapon at his hip. He was young, perhaps her age, and his expression showed more confusion than immediate hostility. He hadn't expected to find a slight European woman in military fatigues operating their communication equipment. "I'm preventing a massacre," Irene said quietly, her hand hovering over the final unlock command. "You can shoot me if you want, but those civilians are walking out of here either way." The officer's hand closed on his weapon, but he didn't draw it. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the small room, 2 people roughly the same age on opposite sides of a conflict neither had started. Irene could see him processing what she'd said, see the moment he glanced at the security feeds and understood what was about to happen. "You're alone," he said finally, and it wasn't quite a question. "Yes." "You came here alone to stop Phase 3. "Yes." Something shifted in his expression, something Irene couldn't quite read. Then he did something that surprised them both. He took his hand off his weapon and stepped back from the doorway. "You have maybe 3 minutes before my commander realizes what's happening. Make them count." Irene didn't waste time questioning the unexpected mercy. She hammered the unlock command, watching on the security feeds as doors throughout the facility began opening. Civilians in the courtyard looked around in confusion, then began moving tentatively toward the exits. In the military holding cell, Lieutenant Voss immediately understood what was happening and began organizing the other prisoners. "There's a weak point in the eastern fence," the officer said quietly, still standing in the doorway. "If your people move quickly and stay together, they might make it to the tree line before we can organize pursuit." "Why are you helping me?" Irene asked, even as she began broadcasting new instructions on the civilian emergency frequency, directing the escaping prisoners toward the eastern fence. Because I joined the Crimson Front to fight soldiers, not to execute children. He met her eyes directly. But this changes nothing between our forces. After today, we're still enemies. After today, those people get to see tomorrow, Irene replied. That's enough. The facility descended into controlled pandemonium as 200 civilians and 3 military prisoners flooded through the open doors. Irene watched the security feeds, tracking their movement toward the eastern fence where the officer had indicated the weak point. Some were helping others, parents carrying children, younger prisoners supporting elderly ones. It was chaotic and desperate, but it was movement, progress, survival. Alarms began blaring again, different this time, security breach warnings rather than fire alerts. The Crimson Front was beginning to understand what had happened. Irene could hear shouting in the hallways, boots pounding on stairs, commands to lock down the facility and recapture the prisoners. You need to leave, the officer said urgently. My commander just ordered a full facility sweep. They'll find you within minutes, and unlike me, they won't show mercy to someone who just released 200 prisoners. Irene was already gathering her equipment, but her eyes stayed on the security feeds. The civilians were reaching the eastern fence, but they were moving too slowly. Families with small children couldn't run fast enough, and the elderly were struggling across the uneven ground. Guards were beginning to reorient from the false southern breach, starting to realize the real crisis was the mass escape in progress. They're not going to make it, Irene said, watching as armed militants began moving to intercept the fleeing prisoners. Your forces are going to cut them off before they reach the tree line. The officer moved to look at the feeds, his expression grim. Phase 3 was supposed to be organized, documented. What's about to happen will be a massacre in the worst sense, panicked guards shooting at fleeing civilians. The death toll could be even higher. Irene's mind raced through options, each more impossible than the last. She needed something that would force the Crimson Front to prioritize something other than recapturing prisoners. Something dramatic enough to draw attention away from the escape. Her eyes fell on the communication equipment, and suddenly she understood what she had to do. It was insane, possibly suicidal, but it might buy enough time for those civilians to reach safety. Does your commander care about propaganda? She asked quickly. About how the Crimson Front is perceived by the outside world? Everything he does is calculated for maximum media impact, the officer replied. Why? Irene was already working at the radio equipment, accessing frequencies that she knew were monitored by international observers and media organizations. Because I'm about to give him a propaganda crisis that will make losing 200 prisoners seem insignificant. She keyed the microphone, this time broadcasting on open channels that would be picked up by anyone listening to the region's emergency frequencies. Her voice was steady, clear, and would be recorded by dozens of monitoring stations across multiple countries. This is Specialist Irene Hill of the West March Intelligence Division, broadcasting from inside the Crimson Front detention facility in Ravensworth. At 0700 hours this morning, the Crimson Front was prepared to execute 200 civilian prisoners, including children, for propaganda purposes. I have infiltrated this facility and released these prisoners. I am currently alone and unarmed in the administrative building. The Crimson Front can either allow these civilians to escape and take me as their prisoner for a legitimate exchange negotiation, or they can massacre fleeing families while the entire world listens to this broadcast. The choice, and the judgment of history, is yours. She released the microphone and looked at the officer, who was staring at her with something approaching awe. You just made yourself the most valuable hostage in the entire conflict zone. I made myself more valuable than 200 civilians trying to escape, Irene corrected. Your commander has to choose now, pursue them and prove to the world that the Crimson Front massacres families, or take me and maintain some semblance of legitimacy for future negotiations. The security feeds showed the result of her broadcast almost immediately. The guards pursuing the fleeing prisoners slowed, then stopped, receiving new orders through their radios. The civilians continued their desperate flight toward the tree line, and this time, no one followed them. Instead, the facility's entire attention turned inward, toward the administrative building where Irene had just announced her presence. She could hear boots thundering up the stairs, multiple squads converging on her location. The officer moved toward the door, then paused. "What you did today will be studied in military academies for years. But you understand you're not leaving this facility, right?" "I understand," Irene said quietly, watching on the security feeds as Lieutenant Voss and the last of the civilians disappeared into the treeline. "But they are." The Crimson Front soldiers burst into the communication room with weapons raised, their faces showing a mixture of anger and confusion at finding a single young woman calmly standing beside their radio equipment. Irene raised her hands slowly, making no sudden movements, her heart pounding but her expression controlled. "I'm unarmed," she said clearly. "I'm surrendering to your custody as a military prisoner." The squad leader, a hard-faced man with commander insignia, stepped forward and gestured for his men to secure her. Rough hands pulled her arms behind her back, binding her wrists with plastic restraints that bit into her skin. The squad leader picked up her tablet, examining the intelligence files she'd compiled, his expression darkening as he understood the scope of what she'd accomplished. "You're the one who've been intercepting our communications," he said, his accent thick but his words precise. "The analyst who decoded our encryption protocols. We've been trying to identify the source for weeks." "Specialist Irene Hill, West March Intelligence Division," she replied, using the formal identification protocol for military prisoners. "Serial number 847-22-4193. I'm entitled to treatment under the military conventions for prisoners of war." The commander's laugh was harsh and humorless. "You infiltrated our facility alone, released 200 prisoners, and broadcast our operations to the entire world. You think citing conventions will protect you? I think the entire world is now listening to every communication coming from this facility," Irene replied steadily. "Your next actions will define how the Crimson Front is perceived by international observers. You can treat me as a legitimate military prisoner and use me for negotiation leverage, or you can prove everything the government says about your organization is true." The commander studied her for a long moment, and Irene could see him calculating the political implications. She deliberately backed him into a corner where his options were limited. Harming her now would be documented, broadcast, and used as justification for international intervention. But treating her properly gave the Crimson Front something they desperately needed: legitimacy as a military organization rather than terrorists. "Take her to the secure holding area," the commander finally ordered. "Separate cell, constant surveillance. No one speaks to her without my direct authorization." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only Irene could hear. "You may have saved those civilians today, but you just made yourself the most valuable asset in this entire conflict. Every intelligence organization in the region will want to know what's inside your head. Pray that your government negotiates your release before someone decides to take more direct measures to extract that information." Irene was marched through corridors filled with militants who stopped to stare at the slight woman who'd somehow penetrated their security and released 200 prisoners. Some looked angry, others appeared almost impressed, and a few watched her with expressions that made her skin crawl. She kept her eyes forward, her posture straight despite the fear coiling in her stomach. The holding cell was in the facility's basement, a converted storage room with concrete walls and a single barred window near the ceiling. The guards removed her restraints long enough to search her thoroughly, confiscating everything including her boots, before securing her wrists again and locking her inside. Alone in the dim cell, Irene finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd done. The civilians were safe, Lieutenant Voss was free, and she'd prevented the massacre. But the cost was her own freedom, possibly her life. She thought about the letter she'd written to her sister, still sitting in her apartment, explaining why she'd made this choice. The rational part of her mind whispered that she should have waited, that proper channels might have eventually worked, that her sacrifice might have been unnecessary. But she'd seen the intercepted communications, had known with absolute certainty that waiting meant death for 200 people. Given the same choice again, she'd make the same decision. Hours passed in the darkness. Irene dozed fitfully, her mind cycling through scenarios of what might happen next. Would Westmarch negotiate for her release? Would the Crimson Front use her as a bargaining chip? Or would she simply disappear, another casualty of a conflict that most people back home barely knew existed? The sound of the cell door opening snapped her awake. A guard entered carrying a tray of food and water, setting it down without meeting her eyes. As he turned to leave, he paused and spoke quietly, barely above a whisper. The civilians reached safety. All of them. The government forces met them at the extraction point. He glanced at her briefly. My daughter was among the prisoners you saved. She's 8 years old. The guard's words hung in the air after he left, and Irene felt tears she'd been holding back finally escape. She'd succeeded. All 200 civilians, including children, were safe. Whatever happened to her now, that success couldn't be taken away. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of isolation interrupted by brief interrogations. The Crimson Front's intelligence officers questioned her extensively about Westmarch's military capabilities, operational protocols, and strategic intentions. Irene provided only her name, rank, and serial number, refusing to elaborate despite increasingly aggressive questioning techniques. They never physically harmed her, conscious that her treatment was likely being monitored through the international attention her broadcast had generated. But psychological pressure was constant, threats about what might happen if negotiations failed, suggestions that her government had abandoned her, implications that cooperation would improve her situation. Irene endured it by focusing on mental exercises she'd learned during basic training, techniques for maintaining psychological resilience under stress. She cataloged details about the facility's layout, guard rotations, and conversation fragments she overheard, maintaining her analytical mindset even in captivity. Old habits were hard to break, and intelligence gathering was what she knew best. On the third day, something changed. The guard rotations became more frequent, and she could hear increased activity in the corridors outside her cell. Vehicles arrived and departed with unusual frequency. Something significant was happening, though she had no way to know what. That evening, the cell door opened to reveal not a guard but the young officer who'd let her complete the prisoner release. He carried a chair, which he set down across from where Irene sat on the concrete floor. He studied her for a moment before speaking. Your broadcast created quite the international incident, he said quietly. There are currently 14 nations demanding your immediate release, 3 human rights organizations have filed formal protests, and media coverage has made you into something of a symbol. A symbol of what? Irene asked, her voice hoarse from limited water rations. Depends on who you ask. To some, you're a hero who risked everything to save innocent lives. To others, you're a reckless soldier who violated military protocol and endangered diplomatic efforts. He leaned forward slightly. To us, you're a problem that needs to be resolved before the political pressure becomes unbearable. So what happens now? Now, we negotiate. Your government has agreed to a prisoner exchange, you for 3 Crimson Front officers currently in their custody, plus assurances of safe passage for our negotiating team. The exchange happens tomorrow at dawn at the neutral zone checkpoint. Relief flooded through Irene so intensely it was almost painful. She was going home. She'd face consequences for her unauthorized actions, certainly, but she'd be alive and free. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to understand something before you leave, the officer replied. What you did was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. You infiltrated an enemy facility alone, with no backup and no extraction plan. By every military standard, you should have failed and died in the attempt. But I didn't fail. No, you didn't. And that's what makes your story dangerous. He stood, preparing to leave. You proved that one person, determined enough and desperate enough, can change the course of events that armies and governments said were inevitable. That's an inspiring message to some people and a terrifying precedent to others. After he left, Irene lay on the concrete floor and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she'd leave this cell, but she understood that her actions had set something in motion that extended far beyond a single rescue operation. She'd broken rules that existed for legitimate reasons, had circumvented chains of command that were designed to prevent exactly the kind of reckless individual action she'd undertaken. The question that would follow her was whether she'd been right to do it, whether the lives saved justified the protocols violated. Irene knew her answer, but she also knew it wouldn't satisfy everyone demanding accountability. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of climbing fences and faces of children she'd never met but had somehow saved. When the guards came for her in the pre-dawn darkness, she was already awake, ready to face whatever consequences awaited her on the other side of the exchange. They transported her in a covered truck, wrists restrained and eyes blindfolded, standard protocol for prisoner movements. The journey took perhaps 40 minutes over increasingly rough roads. When the truck finally stopped and the blindfold was removed, Irene found herself at a checkpoint on a desolate stretch of road that marked the neutral zone between territories. On the opposite side of the checkpoint, she could see West March military vehicles and personnel. Among them, she recognized Lieutenant Voss, standing tall and alive, looking toward her position with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. The exchange protocol was formal and precise. International observers documented every step as Irene and 3 Crimson Front officers were walked toward the center point. As they crossed paths, one of the Crimson Front officers muttered something in his own language that made the guards laugh. Irene didn't need a translation to understand the contempt. The moment Irene crossed into West March territory, military personnel surrounded her. Not hostile, but not friendly either, medical staff checking her physical condition, intelligence officers asking preliminary questions, security personnel maintaining a protective perimeter. Everything was professional, efficient, and notably lacking in warmth. Lieutenant Voss pushed through the crowd, and for a brief moment, Irene saw genuine relief in his expression. "Hill," he said quietly, then caught himself and corrected to formal address. "Specialist Hill. Good to have you back." "Good to be back, sir," Irene replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. The looks she was receiving from other military personnel ranged from curious to hostile. She understood why. She'd violated fundamental military principles, had gone rogue in a way that threatened the entire command structure. The ride back to West March headquarters was conducted in silence. Irene sat in an armored personnel carrier, flanked by military police, while Lieutenant Voss sat across from her. He tried several times to start a conversation, to ask how she was holding up, but each attempt was shut down by the ranking MP officer who insisted that all communication wait for the formal debriefing. At headquarters, Irene was immediately separated from Voss and escorted to a secure conference room where she found herself facing a panel of senior officers. Major Kellerman was there, along with 2 colonels she recognized from previous briefings and a civilian woman who introduced herself as a representative from Military Legal Affairs. "Specialist Hill," began Colonel Whitmore, the highest-ranking officer present. "You're here to provide an account of your actions over the past 5 days. I want to be clear that this is not a formal court-martial proceeding, but your testimony will be used to determine what charges, if any, will be filed against you." Irene straightened in her chair. "Yes, sir. I understand. Then let's begin. On the morning of the planned Ravensworth massacre, you were explicitly ordered to remain at headquarters and await authorized response protocols. Instead, you violated base security, stole military equipment, and infiltrated hostile territory. Explain your reasoning." Irene had prepared for this moment during her captivity. "Sir, I intercepted communications that definitively proved 200 civilians, including children, would be executed within hours. I brought this intelligence to command, but the response timeline was insufficient to prevent the massacre. I calculated that I had the intelligence, skills, and opportunity to prevent those deaths if I acted immediately." "You calculated," Major Kellerman interjected, his voice sharp. "You're an intelligence analyst, Hill, not a field commander. You don't have the training or authority to make tactical decisions about military operations." "With respect, sir, I wasn't making a tactical decision about a military operation. I was making a moral decision about whether to attempt saving lives when I had the capability to do so." "A moral decision," Colonel Whitmore repeated. Specialist Hill, military effectiveness depends on soldiers following orders, even when they disagree with those orders. If every service member decided to launch unauthorized operations based on their personal moral calculations, we'd have chaos. Irene met his gaze steadily. Sir, I agree that military discipline is essential. But I also believe that blind obedience to orders, when those orders result in preventable civilian deaths, is morally indefensible. I made a choice between following protocol and saving lives. I chose lives. The room fell silent. The civilian legal representative made notes on her tablet, her expression carefully neutral. Finally, she spoke. Specialist Hill, can you walk us through your operational planning? How did you prepare for this unauthorized mission? For the next 2 hours, Irene provided a detailed account of everything she'd done, the intelligence gathering, the facility analysis, the infiltration approach, the communication disruption, and finally the broadcast that had turned her into an international incident. She omitted nothing, understanding that complete honesty was her only viable defense strategy. When she finished, Colonel Whitmore leaned back in his chair. Your operational planning was remarkably thorough for someone with no field training. Where did you acquire these skills? I studied intelligence reports from previous rescue operations, analyzed what worked and what didn't, and applied those lessons to the Ravensworth situation. She hesitated, then continued, I spent months preparing for the possibility that a situation might arise where my intelligence analysis could be directly applied to save lives. You've been planning unauthorized operations for months? Kellerman's voice rose. That's premeditation, Hill. That's not a split-second decision under pressure, that's systematic preparation to violate military authority. No, sir, Irene countered. I was preparing to be useful in ways beyond my assigned role. I never planned to go rogue. I hoped I'd never need to use those skills. But when the situation arose where I could save 200 lives, I was ready. The civilian representative asked her next question carefully. Specialist Hill, you must have known that your actions would likely result in your capture and possible death. Why did you consider that an acceptable risk? Irene thought about the guard in the Crimson Front facility, the one whose 8-year-old daughter she'd saved. She thought about the intercepted message that had simply said, please. Children here. She thought about all the reasons she'd joined the military in the first place. Because some things are worth any risk, she said quietly. Because if I have the ability to prevent innocent people from being executed and I choose not to act, then I'm complicit in their deaths. I couldn't live with that. The debriefing lasted 3 more days. Irene was questioned by multiple panels, each examining different aspects of her actions from operational effectiveness to psychological stability to potential security breaches. She answered every question honestly, never trying to minimize what she'd done or justify it beyond the simple calculus that saving 200 lives was worth the professional and personal consequences. Between sessions, she was confined to quarters, not quite a prisoner, but not free either. Lieutenant Voss visited when regulations permitted, bringing her books and news from the outside world. The media coverage of her rescue operation had been extensive. International news organizations were calling her a hero, human rights groups were demanding she be commended rather than punished, and military analysts were debating whether her actions represented admirable initiative or dangerous insubordination. You've become a symbol, Voss told her during one visit. People are projecting their own beliefs onto your story. Some see you as proof that individual courage matters more than institutional authority. Others see you as an example of why military discipline exists. What do you see? Irene asked. Voss was quiet for a moment. I see someone who saved my life and the lives of 200 others. But I also see someone who put themselves at enormous risk and got lucky that it worked out. If things had gone differently, if the Crimson Front had executed those civilians anyway and captured you in the process, this conversation would be very different. But they didn't. The civilians are safe. Because you succeeded, Voss agreed. But success doesn't automatically justify the methods, Hill. That's what the review boards are struggling with. You violated fundamental military principles, and those principles exist for legitimate reasons. But you also achieve something that proper channels couldn't accomplish in time. The formal hearing was scheduled for the following week. Irene would face a military tribunal that would determine her future in the service. The potential outcomes ranged from commendation to dishonorable discharge, with various forms of reprimand and punishment in between. The night before the hearing, Irene sat in her quarters and finally read the news coverage of her rescue operation. Articles described her as everything from the intelligence analyst who became an action hero to the soldier who broke the chain of command. Interviews with the rescued civilians were particularly moving. Parents described watching her broadcast and realizing someone was fighting for their children's lives. The guard whose daughter she'd saved had spoken anonymously to media, calling her an angel who appeared when all hope was lost. But there were also sharp criticisms from military experts who argued that her actions, while successful in this instance, set a dangerous precedent. Retired generals wrote opinion pieces about the importance of military discipline. Strategic analysts questioned whether individual initiative should ever supersede command authority. Irene understood both perspectives. She'd violated principles that existed for good reasons, had acted on her own authority in ways that could have catastrophically backfired. But she'd also saved lives that would have been lost to bureaucratic delays and diplomatic failures. The morning of the hearing, she dressed in her formal uniform and prepared to face judgment. The tribunal consisted of 5 senior officers, including one general she'd never met but whose reputation for fairness was well known throughout the service. The chamber was formal and intimidating, with military precision evident in every detail. The charges were read: unauthorized absence from assigned post, theft of military equipment, violation of security protocols, and conducting unauthorized operations in hostile territory. Each charge was technically accurate, and Irene acknowledged them without equivocation. The prosecution presented their case methodically, emphasizing the systematic nature of her violations and the threat her actions posed to military order. They argued that success in this single instance couldn't excuse behavior that, if repeated by others, would undermine the entire command structure. The defense, appointed by Military Legal Affairs, countered that Irene's actions represented exactly the kind of initiative and moral courage that the military should encourage rather than punish. They presented testimony from the rescued civilians, from Lieutenant Voss, and from intelligence experts who confirmed that her analysis of the situation had been accurate and that proper channels would indeed have moved too slowly. When it was her turn to speak, Irene stood before the tribunal and chose her words carefully. "I don't claim that what I did was proper military procedure. I violated orders and protocols that exist for legitimate reasons. But I do claim that what I did was necessary and right. 200 people, including children, are alive today because I chose to act rather than wait for authorization that would have come too late." She paused, then continued. "I understand that my actions create complications for military discipline. But I also believe that the purpose of military discipline is to enable us to protect people more effectively. When following procedure means allowing preventable deaths, then the procedure has failed its fundamental purpose. I made a choice to prioritize the lives I could save over the protocols I was supposed to follow. I stand by that choice." The tribunal deliberated for 2 hours while Irene waited in an adjacent room. When she was finally called back, she couldn't read anything in the officers' expressions. General Morrison, the senior tribunal member, spoke. "Specialist Irene Hill, this tribunal has carefully considered your actions, their motivations, and their consequences. What you accomplished was extraordinary. You saved 200 lives through intelligence, courage, and determination. However, what you did was also fundamentally incompatible with military discipline and chain of command." Irene's heart sank, preparing for the discharge she knew was coming. "Therefore," Morrison continued, "this tribunal finds you guilty of all charges as stated. However, we also recognize the exceptional circumstances and outcomes of your actions. You are hereby sentenced to a formal reprimand that will remain in your service record, reduction in rank to private, and mandatory reassignment." The words hung in the air, and Irene tried to process what she'd just heard. Guilty, but not discharged. Punished, but not destroyed. It was more than she'd dared to hope for, yet the reduction in rank stung more than she'd expected. General Morrison wasn't finished. Your reassignment will be to a newly formed unit within intelligence operations, one that specializes in rapid response analysis for time-sensitive humanitarian situations. You'll be working directly with field commanders to ensure that intelligence reaches decision-makers quickly enough to matter. Your role will be advisory, not operational, and you will be under strict supervision. He leaned forward slightly, his expression stern but not unkind. Specialist Hill, you prove that you have exceptional analytical skills and the courage to act on your convictions. But you also prove that you're willing to disregard authority when you believe you're right. This tribunal is giving you a chance to channel those qualities into sanctioned operations where your initiative can be an asset rather than a liability. I understand, sir. Thank you, sir. Don't thank us yet, Morrison added. Your new commanding officer has a reputation for being even more demanding than your previous assignments. You'll earn every bit of redemption they're offering you. The hearing concluded, and Irene was dismissed. Outside the chamber, she found Lieutenant Voss waiting, along with several of the civilians she'd rescued from Ravensworth. They'd traveled to headquarters specifically to attend her hearing, to stand as witnesses to what her actions had meant. Among them was a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, holding her father's hand. The guard who'd whispered to her in the cell. He stepped forward, speaking through an interpreter provided by the refugee services. My daughter Elena wanted to meet the woman who saved her life, he said quietly. We wanted you to know that whatever punishment you received, you're a hero to us. To all of us. Elena stepped forward and held out a drawing she'd made, a child's crayon rendering of a woman with dark hair standing between stick figures labeled bad people and other stick figures labeled families. At the top, in careful letters, it read, "Thank you, Angel Irene." Irene knelt down to Elena's level, accepting the drawing with hands that trembled slightly. You're very welcome, Elena. I'm glad you're safe. The little girl hugged her suddenly, fiercely, and Irene felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally break through. This was why she'd done it. Not for recognition or redemption, but for moments like this, for the simple fact that this child was alive to draw pictures and hug strangers. The rescued civilians each approached her, expressing gratitude in various languages, some through tears, others through firm handshakes and proud nods. They'd lost homes and possessions in the conflict, but they hadn't lost their lives, and they wanted her to know that her sacrifice had mattered. After they left, Voss walked with Irene across the headquarters grounds. Your new assignment starts next week, he said. I pulled some strings to get details about the unit you're joining. It's legitimate, challenging work that could actually change how we handle humanitarian crisis situations. But I'll never be trusted with field operations again, Irene said quietly. Probably not, Voss admitted. You proved you're willing to go rogue when you think you're right. That makes you valuable, but it also makes you a risk. The new unit is designed to harness what you're good at while keeping you within proper channels. They walked in silence for a moment before Voss continued. For what it's worth, Hill, I think you did the right thing. I'm alive because you refused to accept that proper procedure was more important than lives. Those civilians are alive because you trusted your analysis and had the courage to act on it. The military needs people like you, even if they don't always know what to do with you. Irene thought about the young Crimson Front officer who'd let her complete the prisoner release, who'd said her story was dangerous because it proved one person could change inevitable outcomes. She thought about Elena's drawing, about the guard whose daughter she'd saved, about all the lives that had continued because she'd refused to accept acceptable losses. I'd do it again, she said quietly. If faced with the same choice, knowing all the consequences, I'd make the same decision. I know, Voss replied. That's exactly why they're putting you in a unit where your instincts can be an asset instead of a threat. You're getting a second chance, Hill. Make it count. That evening, Irene sat in her quarters and carefully placed Elena's drawing in a frame. Beside it, she set the formal reprimand document from the tribunal. Both were evidence of the same action, viewed from different perspectives. One showed the human cost of inaction, the other showed the institutional cost of unauthorized initiative. She understood now that both perspectives were valid, that military discipline and moral courage weren't always compatible, and that living in the tension between them would define her career going forward. She'd been punished for saving lives, which felt unjust. But she'd also been given a chance to continue serving, which felt like grace. 6 months after the Ravensworth rescue, Private Irene Hill reported to her new assignment at the Humanitarian Crisis Response Unit, a small specialized division operating out of a nondescript building on the edge of West March's main intelligence complex. The unit consisted of 15 personnel, a mix of intelligence analysts, field liaison officers, and communication specialists, all supervised by a colonel with a reputation for unconventional thinking. Colonel Sarah Brennan was in her 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate everything. She greeted Irene with a firm handshake and an expression that suggested she'd read every detail of the Ravensworth incident. "Private Hill," Brennan said, gesturing for her to sit in the small office. "I requested you specifically for this unit. Do you know why?" "Because of what happened at Ravensworth, ma'am." "Partly. But more specifically, because you demonstrated an ability to connect intelligence analysis with immediate humanitarian outcomes. You saw data not as abstract information but as lives that could be saved or lost. That's exactly the mindset this unit requires." Brennan pulled up a display showing multiple global crisis situations. "Our mission is to provide real-time intelligence support for humanitarian operations worldwide. We monitor developing situations, assess threats to civilian populations, and provide analysis that helps commanders make informed decisions quickly. We work within proper channels, but we work fast." "It sounds like exactly what I was trying to accomplish," Irene said quietly. "Just with authorization this time." "Precisely. You went rogue because the system moved too slowly. We're attempting to build a system that moves at the speed necessary to actually protect people." Brennan's expression grew serious. "But understand this, Private Hill, you will never have the latitude to launch unauthorized operations again. Your value to this unit is your analytical insight, not your willingness to violate orders. Can you work within those constraints?" Irene thought about the tribunal's judgment, about the trust she'd violated and the second chance she'd been given. "Yes, ma'am. I can and I will." The work was demanding, intense, and exactly what Irene needed. The unit monitored crisis situations globally, providing analysis that informed everything from evacuation orders to resource deployments. Irene's ability to process complex information quickly and identify patterns that others missed made her invaluable. More importantly, she could see direct connections between her analysis and lives being saved. 3 months into her assignment, the unit received intelligence about a developing situation eerily similar to Ravensworth. A militant group was holding civilians in a remote facility, and intercepted communications suggested an imminent mass execution. This time, when Irene brought her analysis to leadership, it triggered immediate action. A rapid response team was authorized within hours, and the rescue operation was successful. "This is what I wanted," Irene told Colonel Brennan after the operation concluded. "A system that moves quickly enough to matter, that treats humanitarian crises with the urgency they deserve." "You helped build this system, Hill," Brennan replied. "By proving that intelligence analysts could think operationally, that caring about outcomes doesn't make you less effective. You paid a price for that lesson, but others are benefiting from it now." Lieutenant Voss visited the unit periodically, serving as a liaison between field operations and intelligence analysis. During one visit, he found Irene reviewing satellite imagery of a conflict zone, her focus absolute. "You seem content," he observed. "I am," Irene replied honestly. "I'm doing work that matters, within a system that actually responds to the intelligence we provide. I don't have to choose between following orders and saving lives anymore." "Any regrets about Ravensworth?" Irene thought about Elena's drawing, still framed in her quarters. She thought about the 200 lives that continued because she'd refused to wait for authorization. She thought about the rank she'd lost and the trust she'd had to rebuild. "No regrets about saving those people," she said finally. "But I learned that there's a difference between necessary action and sustainable practice. What I did at Ravensworth was necessary in that moment, but it wasn't sustainable. This unit, this work, this is sustainable. This is how we create lasting change. Voss smiled. You've grown up, Hill. I've learned that real courage isn't just about being willing to break rules. It's about finding ways to make the system work better, so that breaking rules isn't necessary. She gestured at the crisis situations displayed on her screens. Every analysis I provide now, every report that leads to faster response times, that's me preventing the next Ravensworth. That's me making it so the next analyst doesn't have to make the choice I made. Years later, when military academies studied the Ravensworth incident in courses on ethics and command authority, they would present it as a case study in the tension between individual initiative and institutional discipline. Some instructors would use it to argue for stricter adherence to chain of command. Others would cite it as evidence that moral courage sometimes required breaking unjust rules. But for Irene Hill, the lesson was simpler and more profound. That one person, armed with accurate intelligence and absolute determination, could change outcomes that institutions claimed were inevitable. That caring about people wasn't a weakness in military service but potentially its greatest strength. And that sometimes the most important thing you could do was prove that the impossible was simply a failure of imagination and courage. The young woman who'd been dismissed as too emotional for intelligence work had become the soldier who proved that emotion, properly channeled, was exactly what made intelligence matter. She'd paid for that lesson with rank, reputation, and freedom. But 200 people, including a little girl named Elena, were alive to testify that some prices were worth paying. As she continued her work in the Humanitarian Crisis Response Unit, Irene Hill carried with her the knowledge that she'd found her place, not as someone who broke rules, but as someone who helped build better ones. Not as a lone operator, but as part of a system that finally moved fast enough to save the lives she'd always believed were worth saving. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.